on here right now. This is Jay Styron, president of North Carolina Shellfish Growers Association. We're having a shellfish shucking demonstration. To my knowledge, this is the first time that raw oysters have been available at this conference. Of course, Jay's going to show you his methods to shuck oysters. We'll have a couple other growers here. These oysters are farm raised.
Basically, thank you, Chuck. Basically, why we wanted to do this is to show people that there's more than one way to open an oyster. And also, if you have an oyster farm and your product's going to a restaurant and they start complaining about your shells are breaking, they can't get into them, you will have the knowledge then to take to them, because we actually go to our restaurants with a selection of knives that we think are going to work for our oysters and give them the knives and show them how to open oysters, because basically most restaurants have this knife and this is the only knife. This is what a lot of people have, and it works well for certain oysters, especially wild oysters, bottom cod oysters. They have a much thicker shell, much thicker hinge, and if you notice, this has got a little curved tip on it. That's because it's made to go in and pry the oyster open. So you're trying to open the door with a crowbar. So it works if you've got a very sturdy door. But if you have customers that start complaining about shellfish breaking, shells breaking, because that's another function of a southern grown shellfish. Our oysters, you know, these oysters may be 1.5 years old, and if they're really fast growing, they may only be 1 year old. So you've got an oyster growing this fast, it's got to put a lot of energy into this shell. It's got to put a lot of energy into growing its body. So the shell is generally, for its size, a lot thinner than wild oysters are. And so when you're trying to pry that shell open, you may have it breaking in the back end, you may have it breaking across the middle, because the adductor muscle here is still clamping down hard while you're trying to pop that shell. So if you've got restaurants that are saying they can't open their oysters, they're having problems, you know, bring them some knives. I ordered these 2 knives online. They're both from France, and they're like $6 a piece. But you can see they've got a very narrow blade, a very pointed blade. That's for going into the hinge end and cut the actual hinge apart before you start to pry open. And then you've got this one from Germany. Same method, but you've got a little tab on the side that you can put your thumb on to help you with that momentum and torque to help you pop it up. Another fancy one, this is actually called the Patty Shucker. This was actually designed by a world record oyster opener. He's out of Canada. He designed and developed this knife and uses it. There's also several other designs with this knife with different handles. One's got a perfectly round handle, it's called the banjo. But there's as many styles of oyster knives as there are species and varieties of oysters that have been opened. But they all are meant to open oysters in different ways with different methods. This is a style. Basically, it's this knife, but with a plastic handle. This is the one that I grew up on. Until I went to college, I didn't know people actually opened oysters from the back end. These are specifically made to open oysters from the very front end. This is called a Chesapeake stabber for a good reason. But you know, if you have oysters that are really having a problem opening from the back, you can't open from the front or side with this type of knife, because it's so thin and narrow it can slide in easier, cut the muscle, open it up easy enough. Again, plastic handle, so restaurants can throw it right in their dishwasher, sanitize it, good to go. This one, not so much. Same style blade though. And then
What's your favorite?
Depends on the oyster. The knife has to follow the oyster. Now overall, I've started using this knife as my predominant knife. This is a French style knife. This was like $17. I mean, it's a lot fancier looking, but I figured they've been opening oysters long enough. Now, you also can match your knife to the size oyster you're opening, because while this is a good knife for getting into the hinge, if I'm opening an oyster this big, just the mass of that oyster, you're not going to be able to cut that hinge all the way. And when you start prying, I've broke one of these blades in half because I used a little bit too big an oyster. I had the knife in, but it broke the blade in half. So then I'd go probably with this, which is about the same blade style, but it's a lot beefier, and you're not going to break this. And then, of course, you have this, which I will say it'll probably be good for steamed oysters. I have yet to open a raw oyster with this knife. Now it looks mighty cool when you can hang it on your belt, open your beer with it, and it's made out of a railroad spike here in North Carolina. I mean, and for art and craftsmanship, it's great. Practicality, opening raw oysters, in my opinion, not so much. But if you're taking it to an oyster roast, where your oysters are already open, it's cool to show up with this. So, again, it's mainly to show that there's a different key for every lock, and there's a different oyster knife for most oysters. So, at least try some. You know, if you're really gonna open a decent amount of oysters raw, at least get 2 or 3 different styles and just try them. Invest in a glove or two. If not, the chainmail gloves that actually are cut proof. They're probably not bad either. Or get a dish towel, fold it over and put your oyster on that and hold your hand on top, because as you are trying to stab into an oyster, and at times it may take a lot of torque to push in, and if that knife slips and goes through, it may not stop in the shell. It may stop coming out of the middle of your hand. Or if the shell, when you're pushing down real hard, it breaks and stabs down through. Another method that we sometimes do if we're trying to get into the front of an oyster, actually put your thumb up to the edge of the knife. So if it does slip, you're only going this far and it will stop. You may cut your thumb some, but at least it'll stop. So just some different methods. For this one, I'll start out with this because it's got a little bit more growing lip in it. To make it easier, if you didn't want to just go down and try to wiggle the knife in, which you can do, but if it was too difficult for you to do that, you use the edge of the knife, the handle, to break off some of that and hopefully come through this without going through me. But again, this may be one of those, a different knife, because usually you break it till you get a lip open on it, and again, it's matching every knife where it slips in like that. The muscle you're trying to cut when you're going in from the front is up here on the front third. So basically you're trying to keep the top of the knife up flush with the top of the shell so you don't cut the meat open. So you kind of hold down, you make sure you got the tip far enough in to cut that muscle, swing it back and forth, and then once you cut it, you can work your knife around a little bit. And I will tell you, I'm not the best oyster opener, but you open it, you go underneath and pull it away and then eat it. And in France, when they open oysters for people, they actually leave the bottom muscle attached just to show the people that the oyster is fresh and it hasn't been shucked and just sitting around waiting for people. A little more work, because then you've now got to cut it off the bottom of the shell. So then you do that, and if you're doing it for presentation or for a large group, a bed of ice, because that is the paramount thing with shellfish. Keep them cold. Keep them on ice up until the time you're going to shuck them. And if we were doing this at a public event, we'd probably have ice mounted up on these trays to keep your oysters cold, especially during the summer, and then have a bed of ice to sit them in so they don't roll around and lose all the juice and everything. And then we've got Meunier sauce, which is red wine vinegar, shallots, pepper, and salt, which is a typical French accoutrement. Texas Pete, which is a typical North Carolina accoutrement. And we also have some sauce, Topsail Island vinaigrette dressing from some folks here that have donated that.
Yeah, the Benettis.
So we'll have that available also. And basically this is also a test to see how interested people are for raw oysters. And we also, as growers, we wanted to show you how our product is generally served and sold. Steamed is generally not the preferred way. It's usually raw, and that's what the restaurants all buy our oysters for, unless they are going to do a char grilled oyster. So we're just doing this as a demonstration, let people try our product and let everybody see it, and then go out to your restaurants and ask for our products.